So we're going to look at the project structure and file conventions in Next.js, specifically the app router. And we're going to link to different videos throughout this video anytime that we are referencing something that needs a little deeper dive into that specific subject. But you can treat this as a reference into getting to understand Next.js from a high level. But if you already are familiar with Next.js also, this might be helpful, as I oftentimes find surprising stuff when I'm reading through the documentations, maybe conventions that I wasn't aware of, or something, a hint or a new file or a new convention that is just evolving as Next.js and the app router is evolving or has evolved over the past year. So let's dive right in. We're going to read through the documentation and see this in example inside of a project that I have built to go step by step from a higher level project structure down into the file conventions in your route segments. Now let's just start from top level folders inside of a brand new Next.js app. On the left hand side, I have a brand new Next.js app that I created. You can run the script or clone one of the repositories that I would share a link to in the description to get started with where I am, or just copy the same source code that I am working on right now. Again, links are going to be in the description. So from a high level, you're going to have the app folder, the pages folder, if you're using prior versions of Next.js, and a public folder. So app is the app router, pages, which I don't have here because I'm not using the pages router. And the public folder is anything that you want to serve as static assets into your domain. Before we dive into the app router itself, let's just talk about the top level files that you can find in any project. You have the ESLint, JSON, gitignore, and I have prettier RC. These are ESLint configs, prettier configs, or gitignore. Components, the JSON is just shatcn UI added to this project. If you're installing Next.js brand new, you won't see this. You have your next definition or type definitions for Next.js on the next env.d.ts. The next config is where you would define the config for your Next.js projects. Package.json is your dependencies. I'm using PMPM, so PMPM block is also corresponding to my package.json. I have post.css config for using Tailwind CSS, a README, and a TS config file. So these are the files from a high level that you would find in your project. Let's go inside of our app folder. Now ignore what you're seeing inside my app router for now, including this route group, the global errors, and the not found page. I'm going to explain them in order when we get to that specific file. But let's just start from the layout. So layout is the UI that's shared between routes. You have the outermost layout, which is this root layout that comes out of the box when you install your Next.js application. Again, I have a theme provider because this is using a template that I have on my repository that has a theme provider. It includes shatcn, but out of the box, you just get a regular simple layout like you can see here in the documentation. That's just HTML and body tag wrapping a children. The props is the children. This is going to be any nested layout or pages that you have in your route. Now, inside of our home route or index route right now, we have this layout and we have this page, which is going to be our home page. So let's go to our application here. As you can see, I have this home page. I have a header up top. As I mentioned, it has the theme provider and it's using shatcn. Not very much relevant to this video, but this is our homepage, which gets plugged into my layout. Now, layout is a place that you can define shared UI. So here I have included a header and a footer, as you can see here, which is going to be shared across all of my layouts, nested layouts, and pages. Now, you can have multiple root layouts by using route groups. I'm going to mention it when we get to the route groups. But for now, we're just dealing with one root layout. So let's go back here. The next file you can export from any route segment is a page.jsx, tsx if you're using TypeScript. Now, page is a UI that's unique to a route, and that's how you create different routes for your application. For example, here inside of this company route group, just ignore the company route group for now. I've created a folder called about, and inside of it, I have this page.tsx. This is a way to create a specific UI for /about or a segment. So let's go back to our application, go to company. For this about, you can see I have specified this about page or component. That's just the UI for this specific page. I then have a team and also contact, all exporting their own page.tsx from their corresponding folder, which is how we are going to define routes in Next.js. Now, by default, all of these pages and layouts are server components, so you can turn them into async functions and await any data fetching. Here, I'm just simulating a data fetch by delaying the render of this application by 1 second so that we can see the loading UI as we are navigating between these different routes. Now, ignore what else you can see here for now. I'm going to get to them one by one. So the next one is loading UI. This is to define a loading UI for your route segments. This is going to wrap your segment component with a suspense, and whatever you export from loading.tsx or loading.js, if you're not using TypeScript, is going to be the loading skeleton or the loading fallback. So coming back to this route group here, if I close this outer levels, you can see I have this loading UI defined inside of this company group, which is going to then be shared or wrap all of these page components in this suspense boundary. Now, what I have done here inside this loading component is I have rendered a section with 2 skeleton components from ShadCN, which is just going to basically render this skeleton or animating UI that you can see as I'm navigating between different routes. Now, a cool thing that I want to show you when you're designing your suspense or loading UIs, you can go to React Developer Tools if you have that extension, and if you find your component down in the tree, so you could see this loading boundary for my about page, and you can trigger or toggle the suspense to get into the suspense mode, so you can see your loading UI without having to keep refreshing the page or changing the routes to see the suspense. And you can toggle it back off when you're done designing your loading UI, something really cool. You can also trigger error boundaries from here as well. So when you're working with error boundaries or suspense boundaries, you can find the component in your tree and then trigger or toggle the suspense boundary from React Developer Tools. So that was loading UI. Going back, we have the not found UI. Let's see what this is. Well, the not found file is used to render UI when the not found function is thrown within a route segment. Now, this is similar to the 404 or the custom 404 page that we had inside of the pages router. The difference is that this is for known errors where you, let's say, are fetching your database or encountering an error. And if you're not finding that specific resource, you just call this not found function inside of your route. This in turn is going to show the not found page. We also have an error.js, which is for when things go wrong unexpectedly in your app or in your segment, which we are going to get to next. But another thing I want to mention here is that in addition to catching expected not found errors or errors that are thrown because you called the not found function, the root not found JS file also handles any unmatched URLs for your whole application, which means that users visiting a URL that is not handled by your app router, they will be shown the UI exported from not found JS as well. So let's go back to our app and see what we're doing here. So I have one global not found file over here. This is just showing a button to go back to wherever we've been. So let's go to a page that I don't have, let's say /join. This is going to show the not found page. Could not find this request, and a link to go back to the home page. But also, let me go back inside of my about page. Here I've implemented something to show you how you can call the not found function. So I've created this random number, and if it is more than 0.5, just randomly I'm going to call the not found function. You don't need to return it or throw it. By just calling it, it will throw this type of error, which is going to be handled by the not found file. So let's refresh this page. And hopefully we're going to hit this not found function again. There you have it. So again, this not found function was called. This is, for example, when you're calling your database or you're trying to fetch a resource that's not found, and then you call this not found function. This is going to then return this page that allows the user to maybe retry what they did before or go back to the home page. Now, the not found file or component is a server component by default. Therefore, you can mark it as an async function to fetch data to display if you want. Also, if you wanted to turn it into a client component, maybe because you wanted to use the use path name hook to know what specific path the user was on, or to show a content that's based on the path, you can turn it into a client component and use it as a client component. So let's go back. The next file is an error.js or TS file. This is going to define an error UI boundary for a route segment. It is useful for catching unexpected errors that occur in server components and client components and displaying a fallback UI. Now, error components need to be a client component because internally they're using class components to create an error boundary. So the example that you can see here, let me also show my example here. So inside of this route group, I have this error boundary shared within my route group. So I get the error, I get a reset function. You could use a use effect to log the error to any reporting service that you might have. And you can execute this reset function to try and re-render the contents of your error boundary to hopefully get rid of the error this time. And that's what's explained here. So on props, you get the error object. It has a message property on it. Now, if this error is from a client component, you would see the message. But if this was an error thrown inside of a server component forwarded to this error boundary on the client side, it's going to strip out the messages to avoid leaking sensitive data, but it is going to optionally get a digest property, which is the hash of your error thrown in the server component, which you can use to kind of link this into your server log to find out what the specific error was. Now, as I mentioned, the reset function just resets the error boundary. Now, good to know that error.js or error boundaries need to be client components. As I mentioned in production, the sensitive data is not disclosed if the error is coming from the server component. Now, something to keep in mind is that error boundary will not handle errors thrown in the layout.js component in the same segment because error boundary is nested inside of a layout. So let me show you what we're talking about here. So inside of this route group, I have this error boundary, and then I have a layout. Now, if you're doing something in the layout, for example, you're doing data fetching in the layout and something goes wrong here, this is not get caught by this error boundary. If you need to catch the error that happens in your layout, you're going to catch it in the parent's error boundary. And the reason why is that this error is actually nested inside of this layout. Now, to show you what I mean, let's go back to component hierarchy inside NextJS. So you can export all of these files from your segments. So a layout, a template, we're going to talk about this, error loading.js, which is the suspense boundary, the not found, and the page, which is the actual UI for the page. Now on the right hand side here, if I make this even bigger, so as you can see here, we have the page, and then we have the error boundary. This is your not found error boundary. Then we have the suspense, that's your loading UI. Then we have the error boundary, which is the error, which is the file that we just added. We have the template, which is similar to layout, and then layout. So this error boundary is nested inside of the layout, and obviously it can't catch something that happens outside of it. Again, if you want to catch errors in the layout, you have to go to the parent error boundary. Now, this should help making a better mental map of how things or components are rendered inside of each of your route segments, and what is nested inside of what, or what wraps what, so that you can understand it better. So going back to our page, the next thing that we have is global error. So global error is a specific kind of our error.js, which is going to be inside of our root app directory to catch everything else. Now, this also catches errors that happens inside of your root. So again, it's a client component. It receives an error and a reset function. And as you can see inside my project here, I also have this global error boundary inside of my app directory here. It says that something went wrong and gives the user a reset function for them to try to re-render the contents of this error boundary. Now, one thing that I want you to note is that because this is the global error and it's going to capture the errors that also happen in the root layout, it has its own HTML and body tag. So this is rendering on its own. It's not inside of your layout to be able to catch errors that happens in your root layout as well. As you see here also says it replaces the root layout when active, so it needs to define its own HTML and body tags. Again, when designing error UIs, you can toggle the error boundary inside of your React developer tools as I showed earlier. Now let's go back to the next file is route.js or TS. These are your route handlers or similar to API endpoints that you had in the pages router. You can export a route.js or TS file from any route segment in your app. They do not need to be specifically in an API folder as we need it to in the pages router. You can export it from any segment and you would export named request handlers corresponding to specific HTTP methods like get, post, put, patch, delete, and whatnot. It receives the request object. Optionally, if you wanted to use it, there is a context parameter that contains the specific params for your dynamic routes. And you can also use the next response, which is an extension of the web response API to send a response back. Again, similar to how you would respond back from an API route. Now there's a video on the channel about route handlers in the app router. Again, links are in the description, so find the videos to dive deeper into any of these subjects that you feel needed. Now the next one is template. Template is re-rendered layout, so it's very similar to a layout in that it wraps the page component. But unlike layouts that persist across routes and maintain state, templates are given a unique key, which means client components are going to reset their state and resynchronize their use effects. So anytime that you rely on use effects for, let's say, logging page views and use a state, like per page feedback form, or if you wanted to change the default framework behavior, for example, suspense boundaries only render the UI or the fallback once, and then once you already done it, it doesn't show that fallback UI again. If you need this to be shown every time, you need to use a template. If you're running animations on every page transition, for example, you can use a template. There's a video on the channel where I compare template versus layouts and possible use cases. For example, logging page views and also running animations in that video. So link in the description. Again, watch that if you want to understand how it is different from layout and what would be the use cases and how you would use it in the app router. Again, similar to the layout, it receives a children prop because it wraps the page component. And the only difference is that it is given a key parameter by default, which makes React to re-render the contents of this component. By default, it's a server component, but you can also use it as a client component by adding this use client directive. Now to summarize, when a user navigates between routes that share a template, a new instance of the component is mounted, DOM elements are recreated, state is not preserved in client components, and effects are resynchronized. So if you need that behavior, you could use a template. If you don't, you can use the benefit of using a layout, so it's not going to refetch or re-render the layout on every navigation. It preserves the layout, which is the same oftentimes when you're just changing the page, and re-renders the page component. Again, dive deeper into that video if you need more guidance. Now the next or the last one is default. This is a file that defines the default UI when you're using parallel routes. There's a video on the channel talking about parallel routes in more details, but from a high level, you can render the contents of different pages simultaneously at the same level by creating what's called this named slots, and then have these named slots that are shared inside a specific segment, which allows you to run multiple pages or simultaneously show the contents of different pages in one segment or within the same context. Now the default JS file is the UI to show when NextJS cannot recover the active state when hard navigating to a name slot that doesn't have that specific segment of the URL. Again, I highly recommend checking out the parallel routes video. I also have a video about intercepting routes, which is great to understand these two together. They can work simultaneously when you're intercepting a route and then show a parallel content in an intercepted route. It's more advanced routing techniques, but if you're interested, definitely look in the description for those videos. Now, these are the files that we could export from our routes. Now, let's also talk about some conventions. So how do you nest routes inside of the app router? Well, you would just nest folders. We already learned to create a UI for a specific route. You can just export a page.js or TSX, but if you wanted to create nested segments, you can nest folders. For example, you can have a folder called company and then a folder called about, which is going to create /company/about. Now for dynamic routes, you're going to wrap your folder name with a square bracket. This is going to make this a dynamic route. It is going to receive the params object from NextJS that contains this dynamic segment. If you wanted to make it a catch-all route to not only match a dynamic segment, but also the subsequent segments that come after that segment, and also an optional catch-all route, which not only matches the dynamic segment or any subsequent segment after that, it also matches if you do not have any dynamic segment. I have a video on the channel again about this, link in the description. We dive deeper into dynamic catch-all routes. We show it with a beautiful example there that shows you how you can just define one optional catch-all route to cover all scenarios and all the subsequent segments that might be inside of a to-do app or a user to-do app. Now, the next convention is to create route groups. Now, route groups is to group routes without affecting routing or creating a new segment. So you know how you create segments with folders. So if I were to just create a folder here without this parentheses, it would create a new segment, which means /company. So therefore, about would be a nested folder inside of the company if this wasn't a route group, and we would have access /company and then /about. But as you can see here, I only have /about. That's because route groups don't affect routing, or they do not cause a new segment to be created. It's just merely there to group your routes. It can be used to share layouts. So if you want to opt a specific segment in and out of a layout, you can just create a route group. And now all of my about, contact, and team page share the layout, share the loading, share the error boundary. So it allows you to group or organize your files inside of your app directory, but also allows you to opt a specific segment into and out of a layout. There's a video linked in the description to learn more about route groups and how you would go about using them. But that's the convention of creating a route group. You would wrap the folder name in brackets. Now, if you want to opt a specific folder out of routing, you can just prefix it with an underscore. This makes it a private folder, and the content of this folder would be private, and it's not going to be participated in the routing in the app router. Sometimes you can put your actions inside such a folder or your components inside such a folder. It just takes it out of the routing system. Now, next we have parallel and intercepted routes. To create a named slot, you can use this @ at the beginning of the folder name. And these conventions are for when you are using intercepted routes, and it defines the level of your route being intercepted. For example, this intercepts the route at the same level. This goes up a level. This goes up 2 levels. And then this is intercepting from the root. Again, video linked in the description if you want to learn more about these two specific concepts in advanced routing. Now, the next section is metadata file conventions. If you're using a file-based metadata, there's 2 ways you can export metadata objects, or you can have specific files, as you can see here, for your favicons, for your Apple icons, Open Graph, image, and whatnot. You can read through this. Again, there's a video linked in the description for using metadata in the app router, so you can dive deeper into that. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We talked about the project structure in a NextJS application, and we dive deeper into the file structure or conventions in the app router, how to create a page, the UI for a specific segment, shared UI for a couple of segments or a layout, loading UI, suspense boundary, error boundary, the not found page, how we can use route groups to group our routes. We talked about parallel routes and intercepted routes from a high level. Again, there's going to be links in the description to each one of these topics. With this video and those other linked videos, you should have a good understanding of what a Next.js application looks like and how you can navigate your way through these different files and folders. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.